So week 3 of the Secrets of Power PQ season is over, and not much changed from the week 2 update. There were only 4 decks at play rates higher than 5%, Yoda Data Vault, Anakin Data Vault being at 9%, and Han1 Green and Piett Red being around 5 to 6%. That means the meta is still extremely wide. The vast majority of decks are 5% or under play rate. Most of them are still at 1% play rate from this weekend, meaning proactive strategies like Han1 Green, Han2 ECL, still the best way to go, and also generally powerful strategies that can answer a wide range of things and then consistently present threats like Yoda Data Vault and Kira Data Vault, the premier unit-based control decks, are also really good choices, and it is still advisable to avoid any strategies that want to target some of these most played decks but have some big weaknesses because of that. For example, being very good into Anakin and Yoda, but then being very weak to space-based strategies might not be the place to be. You don't even know if you're going to be playing against an Anakin or a Yoda, with them being such a small representation of the meta. 9% is really not that high. Han2 ECL is still looking very strong. We will look at the data for that for this week in a moment, and recommendations have pretty much not changed from the week 2 update. Yoda and Kira have swapped positions. I now have Yoda as my number 1 recommended deck. Possibly should be Han2 ECL, so I said this last week. Han2 ECL is looking like it is the best positioned so far. I will be talking about this deck a little more later in some of my reasoning for not keeping it or not putting it in the number 1 spot. And Kira, I had a questionable performance with it this past weekend. Not many people played it. Its win rate dropped substantially. Small tangent. I was part of the small sample of Kira this last weekend. I went 3-3 with the deck. I was not feeling well and developed a rather intense migraine by the start of round 4, which resulted in me going 3-0 into 0-3. So I'm part of its lower match win rate performance this week. And then I've also added Han1 Green to my recommendations. I had not included it last week because there are a good number of decks in the meta that it is not great into. Yoda Data Vault, Kira Data Vault being 2 of them, but then also a lot of the slower control decks, although it can go under those. But with the meta being as wide as it is, you're not really guaranteed to hit these decks, as we were just discussing with the meta being so wide. And the deck is just so powerful in what it's doing and so consistent in what it's doing that it is a great deck to choose. It has consistently put up very high conversion rates and very high match win rates. Hopping over to the data from this weekend, this is basically very, very similar to last weekend and the overall sample of data. I want to add on to something that I talked about last weekend for Anakin Data Vault that also, I believe, applies to Piett. Last week, I talked about how we are seeing a 50% win rate, which is not a good place to be for a deck. You really need to be higher than that to show that that the deck is winning enough to be getting to those top 8s. However, it has a really reasonable to good conversion rate at 17.9%. Piett also normally hovering around that at 16 to 20%, and also having a 52% win rate. I went into last week how I believe that part of this for Anakin is deck mastery. Players that have gotten good experience on the deck and have a very good understanding of the deck might be the ones that are performing very well, the ones that are converting a lot, and as such having those high win rates, and then players that haven't developed that deck mastery having very low win rates, which then would even out to around 50% win rate overall. This could also be the case for Piett. I did want to add 2 other explanations for that, one of them potentially being that initiative matters a lot. Anakin very obviously being a lot more powerful with initiative, being able to play the turn 1 first, and then use the turn 1 to kill the opponent's turn 1 while leaving their turn 1 behind with the Anakin ability. and Piett having very good lines with GNK, being able to play a 5-drop ship on turn 2, 5-drop capital ship, having GNK on turn 1 with initiative. It also can set up some crazy lines with ramp, GNK into ramp, and then if the GNK is still alive on turn 3, attack with GNK first, flip Piett. Now we have a 3 discount with 5 resources. We're able to play an 8 cost capital ship. So initiative might matter in these. I do want to add towards that end that my teammate has topped 3 out of 4 decks with Anakin Data Vault. Tyler Dark has done very well with the deck. He's not had initiative in every game, and he is still consistently performing well with it, so that is anecdotal evidence towards that initiative not being the case, and it being more towards deck mastery. Building on what I was talking about for Piett a little more, which could also apply to Anakin, there is some high variation in terms of lines that can be presented. Like the one that we discussed for Piett is just an incredibly powerful line, being able to play a 5-drop on turn 2 or an 8-drop on turn 3. Extremely powerful. But then if it's not doing something like that, it does, the slower it's getting those big ships out, the weaker it is, to the point where it might just be that inconsistency that is the explanation for why it has such average win rate, where the players in an event that are low rolling those lines are the ones that are having low match win rates, and the players that are high rolling those lines have high match win rates, which ends up with a good conversion rate, but then a average match win rate. Talking about Han2 ECL a bit more, last week we saw a very dominant performance from this deck, and we're seeing that continued this week. Looking at the tournaments, there are a 12 and a 10-person event where Han2 ECL top 8'd and won, so that is skewing the data a little bit. But even if we exclude those and look at 17 total decks and 6 of them converted, it still has one of the best conversion rates from this week, and it would still be maintaining the highest win rate, or likely the highest win rate. So this deck is still showing that it has a strong claim to being the best deck to currently be choosing, although the data, we just don't have enough data to reinforce that yet. And to talk about it a little more about my personal experience with the deck in preparing for this last weekend, I ended up choosing not to play it, and that is because when I tried playing it into Han1 Green, as we see here, Han1 ECL is been fairly dominant into Han1 Green in the tournament sample we have so far for the Total Secrets of Power. However, I won a single game out of nearly 10 into Han1 Green with my teammate Titanic, depending on who's calling him that day. He started Stolen AT Hauler every game but one, and won every game that he started with Stolen AT Hauler, which kind of reinforces the belief that this deck might be too weak into space. However, we are seeing it 7 and 9 into Piett, 4 and 7 into Boba. Those have gotten a little better since the data from excluding this most current week. The data we were looking at last week, Han2 ECL was looking a little bit weak into Piett and Boba. It's now looking a little bit better, and it's looking very green into pretty much everything else. It looks still like a very good way to attack Yoda, a very good way to attack Kira, and then even Han1 Green looks very strong into. Han1 Green, the explanation might be that the Han1 Green players just don't know to mulligan for Stolen AT, to hard mulligan for Stolen AT Hauler, or I just don't understand how to deal with that line well enough. And then I also tried it into Han4 Tarkin Town, and I similarly only won one game out of nearly 10 into my teammate Red Dragon. He has continuously shown that Han for Tarkin Town has access to counter lines that from Tarkin Town just existing that would normally be shutting down space decks. For example, Han2 ECL, I would think, wants to be going green unit turn 1 into ambushing Sabine ECL in space turn 2, but if it's ambushing just a 1-cost ship into getting Tarkin Town, that feels pretty terrible, and if that whole passing game takes place, and then we eventually try to get their turn 2 ship, it still doesn't feel great. We're just trading our turn 2 into their turn 2, both using our bases. Han2's using ECL and Han4's using Tarkin Town. It just doesn't line up that well. That might just be Han4 Tarkin Town in particular. Maybe against Vader Yellow, the deck actually has a little bit more play, especially with the later deploy on Vader. Ability to go under it, ability to go wide, getting around stuff like No Glory, but then you have stuff like Outmaneuver, which could end up switching the balance of that race a bit. And I have not looked at it into Admiral Piett or Boba Data Vault yet. Those could also be weaknesses of the deck. But overall, looking at Han2 ECL, it looks fairly dominant in the current metagame, and it is something to definitely keep our eyes on still moving forward. Moving over to the tier list updates for this week, I have shifted Anakin down, so this is off the back of last week saying that it should probably be moving to tier 2, being losing into all of the most played decks in the format, at least for the average PQ player. Again, there is that argument for maybe deck mastery shifts that, and as such it should still remain a tier 1 deck, but it does seem to be struggling a lot, and that is why it is moving down to tier 2. It is going near the top of tier 2 with Palpatine Yellow shifting up to the top, and that is because Palp Yellow has a very good matchup spread into the entire field. Not very good, a good matchup spread into the entire field at this point. There are some decks that is slightly losing into, but it's not that bad. And then the key one in Yoda Data Vault, that it's beating Yoda Data Vault, it's beating Kira Data Vault pretty consistently. And then it's also not even doing that bad in Han 1 Green. One thing that stood out is that it is beating Han2 ECL. Being 6-3 into Han2 ECL seems incorrect to me. Han2 ECL is kind of the premier aggro deck, and that tends to be what Palpatine has an issue with. It could just be the small sample of data, and in general, it could just be the small sample of data is why we're seeing this deck perform reasonably. And then also overall, it does have a good win rate being at 60%. So the deck does seem like it could be well positioned. It's just a very small sample size at the moment. If this had a larger sample and the same numbers, I would say it is easily a tier 1 deck. Other thing I want to talk about this tier list is Sabe and Han 1 Yellow. I had mentioned last week that, first off, and this still holds true, I think if playing either of these decks, there's a train of logic that leads to inevitably playing Han 1 Green. I think that's still the case. And then to look at these a little bit more, because I said there's really no reason to choose Sabe over Han 1 Yellow, I think part of the reasoning people may be having is how Sabe's ability interacts with Yoda, being able to manipulate the top of the deck, control You're My Only Hope, control the flip. The issue there is I think that's kind of a trap, because Yoda's playing a lot of Sentinels, you're not really going to be getting that off consistently, and even if you do, the color combination as a color combination is not that good into blue-green heroic, especially with the extra health on the base. There's a lot of Sentinels, there's a little bit of Restore. This color combination of yellow-yellow, whether it be in villainy or heroic, has historically been something to beat other aggro decks, and not stuff to beat bigger mid-range decks or unit-based control. Unit-based control in particular has always been particularly good into this color combination outside of the existence of DJ. And then in the head-to-head, if we exclude the bait of Sabe Yellow into Yoda, which, just to develop on that a little bit more real quick, again, small sample, but 3 and 9 into Yoda Data Vault, it's just not a good matchup for that color combination. And then once we exclude that, I stand by there's very little reason to choose Sabe over Han 1, because the Han 1 leader has a lot more power in terms of being able to smooth out the curve and play bigger stuff earlier. But then once you're there, in terms of the matchup spread, there's very little reason to choose this over Han1 Green. Han1 Green is very good across the board, doesn't have any really terrible matchups, where Han1 Yellow is primarily something, just the color combination in general is primarily something that's targeting targeting aggro decks. And the last thing that I've updated with this list is I moved a bunch of the lower play rate decks into the extended tier list just to kind of clean this up. I kind of want to keep the condensed or the standard tier list a little bit cleaner. So I'm ending up pulling out a bunch of decks. And looking at the extended tier list, I'm not going to talk about it much here, but this is what my extended tier list looks like. The one thing that I do want to point out is the Han2 Blue 30 versus Han2 Blue Force. I am seeing a trend, or we are seeing a trend towards Han2 Blue 30 being the better performing deck at the moment, having a better win rate, having a better conversion rate. And even though the sample is very small, so it's not incredibly reliable, I think there's some discussion to be had about that. In that Han2 Blue 30, extra 2 health, relevant. I mean, we've seen how 30 to 33 with Data Vault actually matters, so gaining even 2 points health, very relevant. And then it also has the ability to play a wider set of strong units with more of access to space as a line of play, where Han2 Blue Force is really focused on the ground arena and getting the Force activation for specifically Piett. Itinerant Warrior also can activate it, and a card like Mace Windu, which tends to not be included but can be. There aren't really a lot of good, really any aside from Piett, premier Force abilities on units, or in general at the moment. So there isn't too much of a reason to play Blue Force anymore. Piett is still very, very powerful, but giving up the ability to just play a more generalized strategy and incorporate space, I don't think is worth it anymore for just Piett, at least in the current meta, which is why I think we're seeing a lean towards Han2 Blue 30 instead. And then a lot of this other stuff I have talked about in prior videos. So that is all I have for today. I will be back in 2 to 3 weeks with the next update. May the cards be with you, and good luck in any future PQs or any upcoming PQs. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content.